today, we're going to look at 3 of the moons of Jupiter. Images related to Ganymede, the largest of the moons of Jupiter, and Io, and then I hope Europa. Now this is the image, and so we'll do Ganymede first. And remember, that was the one you saw, the first class, this painting from 1532, done by Correggio for the dukes at Mantua, where he does the difficult of showing a figure ascending into the skies, where you really get the sense that he's moving up. Well, we're going to see a lot of changes through this today. Let me just review the first stages of the story, which was known to Homer. So it's a story that predates him. That this Ganymede was just a lovely young man who was a shepherd, actually, although the son of a king, in Troy. And Zeus, spying him and his beauty, seized him and took him up to Mount Olympus, the home of the gods, and gave him immortal life and, fortunately, eternal youth at the same time, so that the gods would always be able to enjoy his beauty, and gave Ganymede the job of being the cupbearer for the gods. Now, this made Hera, I should say, so we're talking about Zeus. Hera, in her usual way, furious, because until that time, her daughter Hebe had been the cupbearer to the gods. But she doesn't inflict anything terrible on Ganymede. What devolves in the story is that Ganymede gets tired of caring for the gods when he sees human beings suffering on Earth. So he upends the wine cup, the ambrosia, everything he has for the gods, and he sends it down to Earth. Now, Zeus did not destroy him for that, but instead put him permanently in the sky as the constellation Aquarius. So that, excuse me, that's the story. The changes are going to come in the way that story is interpreted over time. And we'll follow that in the art. Finding a way to do this every time too, is to get you back in these Greek pots. And this is one from around 500 BC. When the earliest ones, the figures are in black, and then the details are just kind of like etched into it so that you see the orange of the clay background. So that's a sign that this is an early, plus it's a kind of an early figure style. Here's Ganymede, who is identified by his name, running down here, Ganymede. And he's being crowned, and this is Zeus. The cock, this rooster down here, especially from the 5th century, becomes the symbol of a pederastic relationship between the two of them, because in the 5th century, this becomes the love gift that older men gave to younger men. This is just a slightly later, one of those crottiers, mixing bowls, and it shows Ganymede in the function and the way he was first conceived of in these myths. Now, where did I put my cursor? Here it is. So you just see him pouring the wine into the drinking cup here. And there's the eagle of Zeus up above. He is watching, it looks like, making sure there's nothing being spilled. Now, this is not a well-made pot, but this is certainly a wonderful image. It's another one of these mixing jars. When I say it's not well made, you see, when it was put in the kiln, the heat, it didn't get even heat distribution. So some areas are still red here instead of black. But here's Zeus, and he's a man in a hurry. As you see, his striding forward, his arm reaching out, and it's just like a great graphic image. I mean, the arrow just points you. You have to turn around, look at the other side of this. Where this is what you find. And here's Ganymede. What he has is a childhood toy playing with a hoop. And there he is with the cock. He's youthful, beardless, and he has what I swear, I think that's a slight smile. I'm gonna go forward and then come back to this one. That's an example of an interior, the one we're going to go back to, of one of these big drinking cups called a Kylix, K-Y-L-I-X. And the reason I brought this one in to show you the example of the shape was that the interior decoration shows one of these young men reclining at one of those drinking parties. Did you know that's where the word symposium came from? That those were drinking parties? And he holds a cup like that, and he's about to play that game I mentioned before, where he's going to flick that so that the dregs in the wine are going to go over and hit a target somewhere out here. So you always, you men, you shared these with the person on the couch next to you. And you would, of course, this would be covered initially, and then this would be one of the delights. When you drink down, you would find the image. This is this artist, you wouldn't say he's got a confusing design here, but it's the right theme. Imagine trying to fit this in just into a circle anyway. But here's Zeus. Here's a very intricate version of his thunderbolt. And there's his scepter, of course. And you have to disentangle the legs. So here's one of Zeus's legs. Here's the other. He's reaching over to get purchase, because you see here, unusually, you have Ganymede somewhat reluctant. He seems to be wanting to escape, and even his rooster is squawking. So there's a contest of wills going on in this one. Not here. This is about 3.5 feet high. You see, enormously broken up and then patched together. It's from Olympia, where the temple of Zeus was. This probably was on the ridgepole of a small, separate communities had treasuries at these major sites like Delphi. This is probably over the treasury building of one of the smaller locale. Not being able to afford something probably in marble. So now you have that, you see now we're into the 5th century, this is around 480 maybe. There's much more that focus on the erotic aspect rather than just Ganymede for his beauty. But what I'm charmed by this every time I see it. This pose is that pose that you find in on the pottery painting as well. It's just there, almost like an ideogram for the idea of rushing. He's hastening along because he's just found himself a wonderful prize, the young figure of Ganymede. Now Ganymede is holding the cock right here. It's a good reminder that Greek sculpture was painted It's not just in clay that it was painted. Even the bronzes had different colored metals, and certainly marbles were painted. But it's this quite self-satisfied look of delight, that smile. He has a slight smile too. And I have to tell you, that is not some subtle psychological penetration of the characters of these men, but rather a characteristic of all Greek sculpture for about 30 years. And nobody knows if these are meant to be smiles as a way of infusing some sort of emotion into the faces, or if it was just a mannerism of the way they cut the faces in, so it's a little deeper indentation there. But here, it just seems to match like that. Aha, I got what I want. This is pretty ugly. But this is a Roman sculpture. If you're looking at it, because of its sort of inherited importance, it seems to be a Roman marble copy of a bronze sculpture that was made in the middle of the 4th century by a Greek sculptor named Leochares, who in the ancient art history we have, was said that he presented a new view of this subject of Zeus and Ganymede that had not existed before. And that's where now you no longer have Zeus, you have the eagle, that Zeus is appearing. You've seen him as a swan, you've seen him as gold, now here he is as the eagle. This is about only 3.5 feet high, and my supposition, I mean, this is a crummy looking tree up here, I think this was the pedestal for a kind of a table. Romans had such an enthusiasm for making copies of famous Greek works of art, and they applied them indiscriminately, whether it's Pompeian paintings or tabletop sculpture or under the table sculpture or in the garden sculpture. And so this would just be an example. Here's Ganymede's little dog yowling up to see his master disappearing into the skies. When you're thinking, or as we were talking last time about extending marble out over space, like, it's only because this isn't very big, so that's not a great expanse without anything below. The great expanse would be expense, because if you figure you've got a block of marble like this, look how much had to be cut away. And from about that same time, there's this charming pair of earrings, which is in the Metropolitan Museum. You see there the eagle. These are not quite 2.5 inches high, these gold earrings. Now we've come to Pompeii. These are baths near the Forum in Pompeii. I imagine some of you have been there. These are in what's called the tepidarium. So it's, room temperature water. There's a plunge pool in cold, and then there's a hot one, and then there's a in between. I always like to think these are like nooks for clothing, but I have no idea what this is for. But what I'm going to look at is one of the remaining panels of the stuccos that covered the ceiling, because this is characteristic Roman architecture of cheap materials, which are then overlaid with either painting or marble or stucco to give it some grandeur. And this is the part. I thought it's kind of this little section. So here's Zeus. Well, now I guess I should talk to, this is going to be Jupiter again. I mean, since we're in the Roman world. And this is in that curve of the vault. And I noticed this too. This is a figure a winged figure. He represents time. But there are other winged figures up here too. So I think, they put everything that was skyward up on the upper levels of this building. It's really, there's a stucco that would be poured into a mold, but it's really fine work. take a big leap in time. This is a copy of a drawing by Michelangelo. This just shows it to you on the page, and then I'll get a little closer to it. What better indication of the esteem in which Michelangelo and Leonardo were held than that even their drawings were copied repeatedly? There's sort of the telltale signs of a Michelangelo figure, the muscled body and the extreme torsion in his pose. Look at the way that arm comes forward. You find that in the Sistine Chapel. You found that in the Leda and the Leda and the Swan. That's just Michelangelo's hallmark. But then how that also makes such a nice, complex relationship between the two of them. Eagle have him so firmly in grip, and he with great, well, I would think discomfort there, but ease and comfort here. So this is a PC languages that call these abductions, but often when you read about them, they're called the rapes. This is more explicitly sexual than many of them. This is the one by Rubens. And I don't know if Rubens was directly aware of Michelangelo's work or not. There's a hint of that same resting in comfort on the wing of the eagle. Just a little bit of the indication of the landscape here. And something that's really quite funny. So here's his quiver, because he was like, Ganymede was a hunter, and its placement in terms of his physique is, seems pretty explicit. This is one that Rubens did as, I'll show you another one from the same series. In 2 years, he and his army of assistants did about 60 paintings. He got a commission to do 60 mythological paintings to decorate outside Madrid, the king's former hunting lodge, which he made into a sort of a small palace called the Torre de la Parada. And so this format, well, it makes sense, just like the Correggio, for something that's skyward. I mean, who needs the distraction of anything on the ground? But it probably was also placed between two windows where there was just less wall space available. So probably drawing on Michelangelo and drawing on also Rubens' knowledge of other ancient sculpture, because he's taking this figure from the Roman sculpture, the Laocoon. It was discovered in the early 16th century in the Vatican collections, which he had seen. And it's part of Rubens' great genius that he can look at something like this kind of, I guess you'd say politely, an ephebic, sort of a blandly modeled, super emotional, not very appealing figure, and turn it into that robust, living flesh and blood. He had the capacity to see through marble to the human figures that the marble represents. Now, something different's going on here, right? This is by Rembrandt. It's only about 4 years difference in time from Rubens. Look at this chubby chunk of a child going skyward. These are probably his parents shown down here. You see the sky lightening as they go up. But is this an immortal, beautiful youth? No. And this eagle, like a true bird with a seat, has seized his captor. It doesn't even look anything erotic about this. Certainly wonderfully painted. Look at that backlighting on those feathers. But this child having an extreme tantrum, actually not a tantrum, but in terror. He'd been picking cherries down below, but you see he's seeming to trying to push the bird away. And it's a very uncomfortable. He's mainly being held because the eagle has hold of his dress. Boys wore dresses when they're young then. And his undershirt is showing, and hauling him up on him under the arms here. And then there's a detail down here. Do you see he's peeing? I see everybody lean forward. You see that little silvery streak? Well, this is the original drawing of one of the many drawings that Rembrandt did for it, indicating the parents down here, very much interested in the child. And here, what it looks like, what Rembrandt has done is he could not actually do this in the painting, but shows how extraordinarily real the event was he was imagining. His bowels have loosened. He's shitting. He's terrified. Now, how does this happen to the story of Ganymede? Well, it's because it's being shown in Holland in the 17th century, where Protestant Christians had given it a religious context, that these are children who are being seized by God to go into heaven before their time. I'll tell you, this is a big painting that's about, this figure is life-size. And Rembrandt signed it. You see it right there. So that becomes kind of a trope, a theme, a new way to utilize the myth by domesticating it and Christianizing it. A slightly later Dutch artist, whose last name is MEAS, M-A-E-S, actually did a kind of a subspecialty in themes of little boys who died early on as toddlers. And this is a family portrait, of children in one family. So these are two little girls who are still living. This one with a deer, that would be representing the goddess Diana. And this one would be the goddess of grain, Ceres. I don't know if this was meant to be another child or not, this Cupid up here. And here, this would be the child who died. And that almost identical image occurs in another painting. So again, there were drawings and they could base it on. So someone, a bereaved family, could say, I want one of those for my child. The face is slightly different. So there's some individualizing there, but conventionalizing in the overall theme. And then I thought you should look at one that's just outrageously terrible. This is by an English artist, did this about very beginning of the 19th century as his prize-winning work to join the Royal Academy of Art in London. This is big, it's more than 7 feet across. And it's like, oh, give me a break. Yes. The best thing I read about this was actually about the artist's work. It said there's been a great revival of interest in 19th century British artists, but where Hilton's paintings are, they're still mainly in the storerooms. And Gustave Moreau did this just as he had done the Leda. I don't see the combining of different symbolic meanings with this one. It's not overt, and I couldn't find anything about it, nothing specifically Christianizing or anything-izing that I could see. There's the dog. And then the last one I had is Robert Rauschenberg. This is called Canyon. It's from 1959. It's one of the kinds of works he did in the 50s. They were called combines because they're just assemblies of all sorts of different materials. And a friend of his down in the streets in Greenwich Village in the garbage had found someone had discarded this taxidermy specialty, or this eagle. So he used that, and then here, I'll have a detail, I'll show you this. There's a photograph of Rauschenberg's son. So that would be, this is like echoes of the Rembrandt, you see. Looking up, and then the soft pillow sort of calls to mind the softness of Ganymede's body. So it's oblique, but it's there. It's a reference to the myth. There's his son. It's very witty. All right, now we're on to the next moon. And this also you saw, this is Io. I will review her story. This was Correggio's painting of Io. I mean to tell you, I have looked at this every week, and it was the triumph of my day is that I finally was able to make out something I had read about this painting. There is down here, there's a stag drinking from the water. And there's this urn. That's a faint Christian context for this, because it's the psalm. It's you know, as my heart longs for the water, my heart longs for God like the stag for water. Other than that, it's an extremely secular one, as so many of these paintings of Jupiter are. They are celebrating the absolute power of absolute rulers, and of course the element of rape or abduction was not seen as something to be deplored. That was a rightful exercise of their power, and this people subjected to it were supposed to appreciate it. So there are a few paintings of the actual scene of the seduction, but I'm going to show you more that have to do with the whole long tale that devolves from this event. So Io was a naiad, kind of a water nymph. Her father was a river god, and she lived in the sacred groves of Zeus's wife Hera in southern Greece. Zeus, upon seeing her, wanted her. Especially in the sacred groves of his wife, he had to be extremely canny about how he was going to get to this young lady, who also wanted to flee from him. So what he did was blanket that whole area in southern Greece with cloud. And he came to her in the form of a cloud and impregnated her. Now, Hera was suspicious that all of a sudden that area of Greece, which is pretty sunny ordinarily, got cloudy. So she went down And Zeus, to protect Io, instantly transformed her into a white heifer. And so Hera, upon seeing this heifer, oh, what a beautiful animal. Would you give it to me? Oh, what was Zeus going to do? He had to say, yeah, you can have her. Have the heifer. So Hera took the heifer and she gave it to the care of Argus, a 100-eyed creature whose eyes were never asleep all at once, so that he was always vigilant, and he was a shepherd. So he was to guard this heifer. Well, Zeus, what's Zeus going to do about this? He tells his favorite son, who's in Greek Hermes, or in Latin Mercury, the messenger god and also a trickster and a thief, to go down to Argus and beguile Argus and somehow steal the heifer away. So Hermes is going to go down and he's going to take his pan pipes and he's going to go up, he's going to pretend that he's a shepherd, he's going to befriend Argus, and then he's going to play music and tell stories until all of Argus's eyes fall to sleep. At which point, Hermes Mercury will behead Argus. And then he can't turn Io back into human flesh. That's only Zeus can do that. But he can at least get her away. So Hera sees what's happened. She continues to inflict punishment on the heifer by their alternate versions. Either she sends the Furies after her, or a gadfly, like a horsefly, that just torments this heifer, who then travels the world, crossing the Mediterranean. Thence we get the Ionian Sea, going north through Greece over toward Turkey, crossing the Bosporus, which means the ox crossing, going up to Crimea, where in Crimea there was, on Mount Caucasus, Prometheus was still chained. Remember, he was chained to the rocks forever while an eagle would eat his entrails every day, and then they would be renewed at night, because what he had done is to give fire to mankind, and he was punished eternally for that. But Prometheus had the gift of prophecy, and he was able to tell Io where else she needed to go. So she did these other travelings, and ultimately she ends up in Egypt. I mean, this is such a complicated story. She ends up in Egypt on the banks of the Nile. Zeus greets her there, touches her, that restores her to human form, and she's now able to give birth to the child that Zeus had conceived with her, a child named Epaphos. And then this is the part, I know the myth, but I sure would like to know better exactly when this part of the myth developed. Because then in Egyptian mythology, this youth is the same as the Egyptian god Apis, and Io is the same as the Egyptian goddess Isis. So she's absorbed into that. I think ultimately she marries an Egyptian king. She's the mother of a number of Egyptian kings. So this is this extremely complicated roundabout story, and something in that story, the episodes I'm going to show you, is it's a myth that at its genesis has to tell about Greece when it's expanding all around the Mediterranean. When it's bringing in stories about going to that has to be a mythic recounting of the spread from the actual node in Greece proper into being an empire. Actually, it's a large painting, and it's not very good reproduction. An early 16th century painting from Venice, which does tackle the story of the actual, almost to be rape. This would be Hera, who's coming down here. Zeus sees the wife coming. Oh dear, here's Io. And then you get subsequent events here. Here she is as white heifer with Argus watching her. And these figures are really a pretext for a wonderful landscape painting. Look back to that distant light over the mountains. Venice, of course, they're familiar with the Alps. And here you have the sheets of water. You can imagine the sound. This is pouring down, water rushing in the river back here. So it's to appeal to all the senses. The setting, as I was looking at this, I was thinking, oh, look how, this is a kind of a convention in art when human beings were important and landscape was secondary to human beings. The settings are there to sort of obey the people. And look how this tree acts like a canopy over them. Just as, remember in the Danae, there are those velvet curtains on either side of her. So you have something like that. Now we look at some early examples, and proof positive that the Greeks were well familiar with the story is there is no inscription on here to identify anybody. How you would know that this is Hermes or Mercury? He has those winged sandals, and that's a traveler's cap. Then this would be Io as this smiling cow. Just slightly around the edge, and this is the best I could get of it, this would be Argus over here. That's, let's see, I should look at something on this to tell you. Yeah, it's about the middle of the 6th century, so it's early. Then I'm leaping now, right? There are other images too, but I want to move to an Italian painting from Florence with this horizontal format. This is what's about almost 5 feet long. This is one that probably, well, it's on wood, and there are 2 possible original uses for it. It either was a panel on the wall in a room in a palatial setting, or this would be put on a wedding chest. And there is another panel, I couldn't get a reproduction of it, that was a matching one. Maybe if these were on the chest, it would have been on the opposite side, because this is the second half of the story in a continuous kind of narrative. And I do have a couple of the details from it. Here's Zeus. Here's Mercury with his staff coming down to the ground. Now he's disguised himself as a shepherd. And here he takes those same 5 sheep, goes up here and says, oh, hello, here's Argus. Now, Argus is not shown with 100 eyes. I think the painter whose name we know, he just blanched at the thought of how you can represent that. But there's Argus, and here's Io. She is, oh my goodness. You know, this is an artist who's never tackled painting a cow. No one ever taught him how to do that. That is quite the most stolid creature ever. And she's not white either. So then here you have, he's playing his instrument, and Argus getting mighty sleepy. He fell asleep. He's been beheaded. Here's the head. Now this is Hera. What she does with that head, I bet you didn't know this before. With those 100 eyes, she took those eyes and put them on the tail of her bird. That's where the peacock feathers with the eyes came from. Those are the eyes of Argus when he fell asleep when guarding Io. And here are the Furies. Actually, this other way so I can see the rest of the image. Rather ungainly young ladies chasing the even more ungainly Io. And this is meant to represent the Nile. She crosses the Nile. She's transformed again to her human form. Here Zeus is, should I say now? Here I'd say Jupiter persuades his wife, Juno, Hera, to that Io has suffered enough. And here is Io now as the goddess Isis. So everyone who I know has written about this assumes that there is some marriage-oriented message in here for the bride, but there's no certainty what that message is. It makes it look like the message is put up with anything that comes your way, but I doubt that that would be it. And from about the same time, this is another panel like that, just a little bit of the end of the story. Here's Io, the Nile, Jupiter and Juno. And Io here is being restored to her parents. I brought this in not because it's a great image, but there was a point that I'd been wanting to make and I didn't know where I was going to find a way to put it. In medieval renditions of classical stories, figures are often shown in what was contemporary rather than classical clothing, because in a prehistory consciousness, the past was simply earlier than now. And there was not even a sense that the manners or the mores or the costuming of people would be different than it was today. This is a Dutch 17th century example, early 17th century. It's not too big, about 2.5 feet across, by a Dutch artist that actually was a teacher of Rembrandt for a short time. And this artist had been to Rome. Rembrandt never went to Rome. And when he was in Rome, he saw works like artists by Caravaggio and the new Baroque, extremely dramatic placement of figures and very dark and light scenes. So he's bringing back the latest in art. And then he brings in a classical myth and he gives it not so much a moralizing, but almost a comedic quality of a kind that was really loved in the Netherlands, because this is like the man caught out by his wife. So here's Hera. You can see look at consternation on his face. Beautiful cow. Here's Cupid. And this figure here with this oddly bronzed face, that's a mask, because this is the figure who represents deception. And he's whisking away that that's meant to be royal purple cloth to reveal the ox here. You know, Lessman looks a little bit like he's working at the edge of his form there with a kind of strange foreshortening or collapsing in the ribcage right here. The wonderful cows, there are many wonderful cows in Dutch art, because the Dutch only in the 17th century were able to pasture many cows. They retrieved enough land from the soil so they could have the cows for the wonderful milks and cheeses. And this is also by a Dutch artist, a man named David Teniers. His main specialty was landscapes, and this is a little one done on copper. So this would have been like kept in a cabinet of curiosities. That's a really splendid landscape here. And you see the story played out between the birds as well as the exceptionally human-looking Juno and Jupiter here. So the cow's okay, but this is not a man who does human figures mainly. And he very seldom does classical myths, but it ennobles the landscape. And the psychology is less obvious in her outrage and her gesture there than it is in the angle of that peacock's head and the defiant rebuttal from the eagle. So then I want to show you just a couple of others from later parts of the story. This is in its exuberant form. You might almost have a sense who this is. This is a Rubens in his workshop. Not particularly well foreshortened figure here, but this is where Hermes Mercury is going to behead Argus. Now, I don't know what's supposed to represent the 100 eyes. They're largely, I think you just have to know the story as you would because of the representation of the cow. With this, there was, again, with these landscapes, you've got water, you've got sunlight, the fields, all these delights to pay attention to. And why this became a subject, I mean, there are other beheadings in classical mythology, why this one would be important. That there was a 16th century, late 16th century Dutch man named Karel van Mander, who did a kind of an allegorizing of all of Ovid. Remember you saw that moralizing Ovid in the late French manuscript last time with Zeus in bed with Danae. But the message is that because Argus was charmed into complete relaxation, not paying any attention to his duty given to him by the gods, by the goddess, he was seduced by the music and the storytelling. It is that that's lust and desire. Lust and desire lead you astray. And in fact, finally kill you. So that's the extremely rigorous moral you're supposed to be able to find in this. Is that Dutch artist who did the same thing that now he does do some eyes back here. This is slightly earlier from a period, I brought it in because it's such an extraordinary painting from the period called Mannerism, which is a sliver of time style between the Renaissance and the Baroque in the 17th century, when there was a love of, a delight in things that were mannered or bizarre. And what could be more bizarre here? Not so much the story or even the 100 eyes, but that in the painting, what is prominent is Mercury's bare foot sticking out at us. And what is so very secondary is Io over here. Oh, I think I'll be on that one. Let's show one more that Rubens did in connection with this series. So here you have just that. Here's Juno, and here's Argus, headless, but this is marvelously discreetly done. And those eyes, which you have to somehow imagine her taking from the corpse, are then being handed to the cherub who will put them on the feathers. And what a display of feathers and satin and furs and flesh, male and female flesh, rainbows. It's just cupids. He just turned things out like this effortlessly. And the last one from the story, I take you all the way back to Pompeii, because it was the last part of the events. Here is Io, this would be a figure who represents the river god of the Nile. She's landing on the shores and being here greeted by Isis. There was a temple to Isis in Pompeii. I mean, Egyptian religion well infiltrated the Roman and Hellenistic Greek empires. Okay, got a little moment for another story. That's of Europa. I won't even go through the length of this story, but it's, in fact, I won't even show you that early one. Let's go on to something. Europa was the daughter of a king of Phoenicia. Now, the Phoenician Empire was surrounded the Mediterranean early. Its main centers were in Lebanon, like the city of Tyre. Well, Europa went down to the shore with her handmaidens. She's the daughter of the king. And Zeus, who saw her, fell for her beauty and came down to her in the form of a bull. And Europa and her friends who were picking flowers, seeing this handsome animal, Europa brought a garland of flowers and put it around the bull's neck, and the bull being so tame, Europa decided to mount it. The minute she did, the bull, Zeus, turned around, swam, and then flew up into the sky, ultimately taking her to Crete. We're not going to go through her three sons and what happened to them, although one becomes the king of the underworld. But I'm angling because I want 3 or 2 paintings, especially for you to see. But here, this early, well, 4th century pot, it's not so early. So these are the sea creatures. They're all named. I have this nice detail. See her here in her. How is this for a reminder of how elaborate clothing could be? Just think of these pure, dull whites worn by everybody. Not so. Here's her name, Europa. This is the Pompeian fresco of her, Europa on the bull. Next, this. This is at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, and I have to confess it's someone from the museum who said this, but there's some agreement that this is the finest Renaissance painting in all of North America. This is Titian's version of the Rape of Europa. It dates to 1562, and show you another. It's one of the series he did for the Philip II in Spain. These 6 paintings called poesies or poems. And he did 2 from the Metamorphosis. So you have this splendid, robust figure fleeing in the sky, and the cherubs come tumbling in, her maidens on the shore, on this great distant landscape. This was cleaned. It's supposed to be in a big exhibition this year, but of course I'm sure that's all being reunited with the other paintings in this series done by Titian. I'm sure that's a plan that's on ice right now. So just as a reminder for you, this is what varnish does, how it yellows everything in time. And this is how far it had been cleaned when you're looking at it. But this is wonderful flecks of water down here. And humanized expression on the great bull. This scaly sea creature, their reflections in the water, these alarmed maidens calling back, come back. Animals grazing at the shore. This is what it looked like in the newly refurbished room at the Gardner. So it gives you some sense of its size and what paintings like these in their original settings would be somewhat similar. Van Dyck made one. So this is the other one you saw that Titian did for that same series, that Danae. And you remember that Rembrandt also did a Danae. Well, Rembrandt also did the Abduction of Europa. This is not quite 3 feet across. And I want to spend just a few minutes talking about this because this is a very different image. For one thing, I have detail of this and I have a detail here. These young ladies are wearing 17th century, really theatrical costume. There's a city back here with a 17th century crane for unloading ships. This painting was done for a man whose name is known. He was in the Dutch East Indies Company. And he had opened a port in Japan, and then he became the governor of Batavia, which is Jakarta, before he came back to Holland. He was a great patron of Rembrandt. And it seems that the changes made in here are all a reflection of the career, heightening the career of the merchant who bought this, because, of course, Amsterdam's a great mercantile center and a trading center on the water, a maritime center. Of course, Tyre and Phoenicia was one too. This is an African figure supposedly here, and this is Far Eastern. And this man was in the Far East. Europa, who comes then from the eastern side of the Mediterranean, settles in the West, and the territory that we now know named as Europe takes her name from that. So it's about the East and the West. And that embraces that man's career. So nothing theological here, purely symbolic, purely wonderful painting. Look at the flecks of light here, the flecks of light there. And then I'll show you these 2 little bits. Oh well, here she is. With his extraordinarily concrete imagination, as is in that poor Ganymede in his terror when he's lifted up. He is showing a young Dutch girl here. And the last one I'll show you. So when you look at this water, you see why he was called the Titian of the North. And the most, to my mind, extraordinary feature, he's called that because of the fluency and the way he uses the color in oils. But how he got that without ever seeing the originals. These are the garlands that they were braiding for the figure that they didn't know was Zeus. So on that look of horror and surprise and hand-wringing alarm, I'll stop this for today. Take any questions and any comments. And you know, next week, we're just going to be looking at love, love, love. Some of the stories about Aphrodite and very many images of her. So please unmute if you have anything you want to ask.
Any questions?
The black hooded figures, the Furies, in which painting would that have been?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
It was oh shoot,
Heidi, this is for you.
Chasing the cow?
yeah.
No, those are called Furies. They're minis.
That Heidi,
Yes.
Oh, sweet.
I didn't hear your answer. I'm sorry, I didn't hear your answer because somebody was talking.
You know, if I guess, just be aware that if you're unmuted, that's other people.
She's a lovely
Some people say that it's the Furies who chase her, and some say it's the Fates who chase her. So it could be, yeah. Other question? Oh, yes, I did say that rape is not considered criminal or despicable. When it's by Zeus, you're being overcome by the god. That's a kind of rapture that's wanted in most religions.
Maybe the word rapture comes from rape?
Yes,
Probably
both from the Latin word for seize, raptus. Yeah.
Okay.
Being seized. Anybody else? Anything? Any? No? Okay. I'll see you next week.